She built an entire life around being unbreakable. That's the image you know. The gun-toting adventurer from Hart to Hart. The woman who could ride, shoot, fly, and outlast almost anyone in Hollywood. But at 83, Stefanie Powers finally said something she had spent decades avoiding. She named the one person she loved most. And it wasn't who most people expected. If you grew up watching classic television, you know her face. You know the confidence, the sharp wit, the glamour that never seemed to fade. What you probably don't know is what she was carrying underneath all of it. Because for years, Stefanie Powers gave interviews, walked red carpets, and built an entire second career, all while quietly protecting the memory of a man most of the world only knew as a movie star. Let's back up. Because to understand what she revealed, you have to understand what she lost. And before we get there, understand this. Stefanie Powers has never been the type to play the victim. Not in interviews, not in her memoirs, not in the way she talks about her own life. She's spent 60 years being the strong one, the capable one, the woman who handled everything without complaint. Which is exactly why this admission matters. Because when someone who has never asked for sympathy finally tells you who mattered most, you listen differently. Stefanie Powers started young. She trained as a dancer, broke into film in the early 60s, and quickly became one of those actresses who seemed to do everything right. She was disciplined. She was smart about her choices. And by the time Hart to Hart made her a household name in the late 70s, she had already lived an entire life most people never see on screen. She was engaged once before any of that. To a man outside the industry, and by all accounts it could have been a simple, uncomplicated life. Steady, safe, the kind of life a lot of people would have chosen without a second thought. Stefanie Powers didn't choose it. She walked toward something far more difficult instead. That life included William Holden. If you don't recognize the name, here's the short version. Holden was one of the biggest stars of his generation. Sunset Boulevard, Stalag 17, an Academy Award, the kind of career that made him a legend before Stefanie Powers ever met him. He was also 25 years older than her, married with children, and, by most accounts, already struggling with the thing that would eventually take his life. None of that stopped what happened next. They met in the early 70s. And what started as a working relationship turned into something neither of them planned. It wasn't a scandal splashed across headlines the way people expect. It was quieter than that. Steadier than that. For nearly a decade, they built a life together that had almost nothing to do with Hollywood at all. Because here's the part most people miss. Stefanie Powers and William Holden shared something bigger than romance. They shared a cause. Holden had fallen in love with Africa long before he fell in love with her. He co-owned a wildlife conservancy in Kenya, and he poured his money, his time, and eventually his heart into protecting animals that had nowhere left to go. When Stefanie Powers entered his life, she didn't just join him for the ride. She became part of the mission. She learned the land. She learned the work. She learned what it meant to fight for something that couldn't fight for itself. And this is where the story gets complicated. Because Holden was still married when their relationship began. He was drinking heavily. He was, by his own admission, a difficult man to love. Stefanie Powers stayed anyway. Not because she didn't see the problems. Because she did, and she chose to stay through them. For almost 10 years, that was her life. Not the version people saw in magazines. The real one. The one where she watched someone she loved struggle, and stayed close enough to try to help. Think about what that actually asks of a person. To stay isn't romantic in that context. It's exhausting. It's watching someone slowly lose a battle you can't fight for them, while the rest of the world only sees the glamorous couple on a Kenyan savanna, sunlight behind them, cameras loving every second of it. Nobody photographs the parts that come after the cameras leave. Stefanie Powers lived in those parts for nearly a decade. Then, in November of 1981, William Holden died alone in his apartment. He had fallen during a drinking episode, hit his head, and bled to death over several days before anyone found him. Stefanie Powers was not there. She had been in Africa, continuing the work they had built together. When she got the news, imagine that for a second. Imagine building a decade of your life around someone, around a shared purpose, around a version of love that most people never get to experience, and then losing him in a way that gave you no chance to say goodbye. Most people would have walked away from that grief and buried it. Stefanie Powers did the opposite. She turned it into a mission. She founded the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, continuing the exact work they had built side by side in Kenya. She didn't do a few interviews and move on. She has spent more than 4 decades keeping that conservancy alive, training rangers, protecting land, and making sure that the thing Holden loved most outside of her didn't disappear when he did. That's not the behavior of someone who had a fling with a movie star. That's the behavior of someone whose entire sense of purpose got rewritten by one relationship, and she didn't do it from a distance either. She has gone back to that conservancy again and again over the decades, walking the same land they walked together, checking on the same programs they started side by side. This isn't a foundation with her name attached that she funds from a comfortable office somewhere. It's a living, ongoing commitment that she has personally shown up for year after year, long after the world moved on to other headlines. Consider how unusual that actually is in her industry. Careers end. Relationships end. Public attention moves to the next story within a news cycle. Stefanie Powers had every excuse to let this one fade quietly into the past along with everything else. She didn't take it. So when people ask Stefanie Powers, even now, decades later, who she loved most, you'd think the answer would be complicated. She had other relationships after him. She built one of the most successful careers of any actress of her generation, largely on her own terms, without needing a man beside her to do it. She kept working steadily through the 80s and 90s. She kept showing up on stage and screen well into her later years, never trading on nostalgia alone, always finding new work to do. By any reasonable measure, she had every reason to name someone else. A safer choice. A tidier story. One that didn't require explaining a married man, a struggling addict. A decade spent loving someone the tabloids loved to gossip about. But at 83, when she's had every opportunity to soften the story, to make it more palatable, to give people the easy answer, she hasn't. She has continued to point back to Holden. Not because their relationship was simple. It wasn't. Not because he was easy to love. He wasn't. But because what they built together, the conservancy, the shared purpose, the years of choosing to show up for something bigger than themselves, became the thing that defined the rest of her life. Here's what makes this different from the typical Hollywood love story. This isn't a tale about a woman who found her soulmate and lived happily ever after. Holden died with the relationship still complicated, still unresolved in some ways. Stefanie Powers didn't get closure. She didn't get an ending that wrapped up neatly. What she got instead was a choice. She could let his death be the final chapter, or she could let it be the beginning of something else. She chose the second option, and she has spent 45 years living inside that choice. Think about how rare that actually is. Most people who lose someone complicated let the complications win. They let the unresolved parts of the relationship become the whole story. Stefanie Powers didn't do that. She took the parts of Holden that were worth keeping, the passion for conservation, the belief that one person could actually make a difference for something voiceless, and she built the rest of her life around those parts instead. That's why, even now, in interviews where she's asked about her career, about Hart to Hart, about the string of other accomplished men she's known over the decades, she keeps coming back to him, not out of sentimentality, out of something closer to duty. Like she made a promise, even if no one ever heard her say it out loud, and she has spent every year since making sure that promise gets kept. There's something worth sitting with here. We tend to think of great love stories as the ones with happy endings, the ones where two people stay together until the very last day, holding hands, everything resolved. But Stefanie Powers' story suggests something different. Maybe the deepest kind of love isn't measured by how the story ends. Maybe it's measured by what someone does with the years that come after. She could have let William Holden's death be a tragedy that happened to her. Instead, she turned it into a responsibility she carried forward, one that has outlasted almost every marriage, every partnership, every headline from that era of Hollywood. At T83, she didn't need to say his name again. She's said it 1,000 times over the decades. But every time she does, it carries a little more weight, because she's not just remembering a man anymore. She's still doing the work he started, still protecting the land he loved, still showing up, year after year, for a mission that most people would have quietly let go.